Hello, I'm Vice Chairman Thomas Hicks with the United States Election Assistance Commission. Earlier this year, President Biden issued an executive order promoting access to voting. As part of this order, the EAC was asked to assist and support a variety of federal agencies as they gather information and develop strategies to improve access to the ballot box. The conversation today will focus on barriers for voters with disabilities face in casting a private and independent ballot and strategies to overcome those challenges from the advocacy perspective. Collecting and sharing best practices for accessible voting is an important part of the EAC's work, and we're happy to contribute to this efforts. Today, I'm speaking with Wendy Heyn, Voting Advocacy Outreach Specialist for Disability Rights Wisconsin, Leah Sifuentes Davis, Senior Litigation Attorney for Disability Rights Texas, Paul Spencer, Staff Attorney for Voting Rights and Disability Rights California, Fred Nisen, Supervising Attorney for Voting Rights also with the Disability Rights California, and Maria Town, President and CEO for the American Association of People with Disabilities. Thank you all for being here today. I want to keep this as informal as possible, but I wanted to ask you a few questions as we go along here. I'm going to start with something I think is pretty positive and go with, from your position, what has been the most impactful aiding for people with disabilities for their right to vote? Anyone can jump in and answer.
I'll go ahead and start, but I hope to hear from others as well. I think technology obviously has had a huge impact, and the way that technology has expanded access for people with disabilities in voting. Of course, it has its drawbacks, and I'm sure we'll discuss some of that as we go along. But the different technology developments have been very useful, in especially access for individuals who are blind or have a visual impairment, as well as other technologies like the sip and puff machines that allow people to vote independently. But as I'm sure, like I said, we'll discuss, those have had drawbacks as well. And there has been a push as well for kind of reverting back to more simple technology, which is a paper ballot. And I think the disability community has concerns about what a paper ballot would mean for the advances that have been made. So I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to discuss that, but I'm interested in others' perspectives as well.
Anyone else?
This is Wendy from Disability Rights Wisconsin. I think I feel like the broadening of availability of the absentee ballot, and that would go hand in hand with technology, being able to request an absentee ballot more easily, has been just a huge barrier that's an alleviated barrier kind of for folks, because we know that transportation is such a huge issue for people in the disability community. And so being able to vote from their homes and easily get those ballots, and we have a lot of barriers to get cut down with that as well, but there has been broadened access to those absentee ballots for people, and especially recently with the pandemic, I think we saw that. So I feel like that's just really huge for people to be able to vote from their homes and safely do that.
This is Maria. I'll just add, and perhaps I'm inspired by Wendy's background, but I don't think we can talk about improvements to disability voting access without mentioning the Americans with Disabilities Act and the mandates that it set up for accessibility of polling places. Now, we still have a long way to go in terms of enforcement and actually continuing to make polling places accessible, but the ADA really does set up the reality that disabled people have a right to accessible polls and an accessible ballot, and that our vote, that we should be voting in our powerful voting constituency.
Great. If
I'll follow up on what the technology and accessible by mail is a big improvement. However, there are some issues with that we will probably go into later.
Okay. I think that that's really true when to talk about vote by mail. And Paul, if you don't have anything to add, I'll go on to the next question. As advocates for voters with disabilities, you have a unique perspective on this topic and an understanding from the members you serve. To continue this discussion, can you describe some of the feedback on challenges and successful practices that you've received from members and your voting and from voters with disabilities? I want to concentrate on two basic areas, basically describing barriers that people with disabilities face when registering to vote, and then going on what Fred was saying, describe barriers that people with disabilities encounter with voting by mail. Anyone want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll start. So I'm always envious when I'm on a panel with voting folks in other states that is not Texas. Because in our state, we have a lot of barriers, and in fact, those are being made even more challenging for people to vote by mail, even more challenging to register to vote than it previously was, which was already one of the hardest states in the country to vote. But in terms of registering to vote, Texas doesn't have online voter registration. So you have to do voter registration by mail. And so that's certainly a barrier for individuals who have to figure out a way to fill it out and then get it to a mailbox and mail it, which can be a challenge, as we all know. So an online voter registration would go a long way toward making it easier for people to register to vote. And in Texas as well, we don't have same-day voter registration. It has to be 30 days before the election day that you have to postmark your voter registration. So that's another barrier. And then voting by mail, Texas is a difficult state to vote by mail. There's only a small number of people who are eligible to vote by mail in Texas. There is a disability provision, but it's no excuse absentee ballots like other states have. And then, of course, we also have paper ballots in Texas. And so for people with visual impairments, there is no way for somebody to independently and privately fill out a ballot. And in fact, in our most recent legislative session, there was additional challenges making it more difficult for somebody to vote by mail, including narrowing the scope of what a disability is, of who would qualify to vote by mail in Texas. I won't go on for very much longer because I'm interested in what others have to say about maybe better things that are happening in their state around these two provisions.
This is Paul with DRC. Leah, that's a tough act to follow on Texas to now talk about problems we have in California, but be patient with me. So, I mean, in California, we do have online voter registration, which is wonderful. The Secretary of State's website is accessible for people with disabilities. We get good feedback on how well it actually works. But there still are some issues, like the signature requirement in California, how people with disabilities get a signature on file that's later going to compare with the signature they use when they vote. So there remains challenges there. Another thing is, you can register to vote at the DMV, but the pad that you sign at the California DMV, it's sort of hard to replicate that signature with pen and paper later on. We do have accessible computers at the DMV. That's one success that Disability Rights California pushed for at the California DMV. So we got them to install accessible computers, which is wonderful. Just another voting issue we have, and I imagine this takes place in other states as well, is trying to get full compliance with the National Voter Registration Act. So, for example, we have designated agencies in California that have really low voter registration numbers that we can see online. I mean, by the amount of people that they're serving, they should be having more. So trying to improve compliance is one thing. And because, I mean, it's important, it's the spirit of the NVRA, is that people with disabilities are getting the same amount of voter registration opportunities people without disabilities are getting. And the fact that some of those agencies really, they might not be doing as good of a job as we think they should be. So that's one thing we'd like to see is better NVRA compliance. I'll turn it over to some of our other colleagues, but Fred and I would like to talk more about our accessible vote by mail in California and some ways that it could be improved. In particular, to have an electronic return option for people with disabilities. That's a frequent complaint we're getting from voters, that having to print, sign, and mail it back in is a significant accessibility barrier, especially for people with print-related disabilities.
This is Wendy from Wisconsin. So I think we're somewhere a little bit in the middle of Texas and California here. We do have online registration, but we have a our registration, our online registration is pretty accessible, and we get a lot of good feedback about it. We do have same-day registration in Wisconsin as well, which then makes us exempt from the National Voter Registration Act. So so we would really love to see more compliance with that, just because it's the right thing to do. And that's definitely something that we're working on, getting agencies to want to do that. But we feel like that's a really something that we missed, because we're very thankful for the same-day registration, but we also feel like that a lot of people are getting missed because they aren't being that they're not being met there. So so that's really something that we want to work on. Our voting by mail is we do not have an accessible ballot available, so that's really difficult for a lot of populations, especially the blind and visually impaired population. We also have seen our state legislature has passed several bills that are going to narrow the scope of voting by mail and who's allowed to bring ballots back to drop boxes, if and where drop boxes can be, and a lot of other things that are going to make the obstacles we believe are going to disproportionately affect voters with disabilities. So those bills did pass, several of them, but they still could be vetoed possibly. So we're pretty worried about going maybe the wrong direction in this. Our vote by mail, as everybody else, we've seen that people don't trust the postal system or it's not as quick as they need it to be, or things like that. So we saw a lot of positive things with drop boxes this past election season. But again, it looks like Wisconsin's going to put some parameters on that too. So that's some concerns that we have here with accessibility with voting by mail and registration.
This is Maria from AAPD. To add to everyone's comments, voter ID is a huge barrier to voter registration. Many people with disabilities, especially older adults with disabilities, do not have access to a current ID. And so that precludes them in many states from being able to register to vote in the first place. When it comes to vote by mail, I want to echo everything that's already been said, but particularly emphasize that in order to vote by mail, you need to have access to and contact with the Postal Service to begin with. And many communities, particularly rural communities and tribal communities, don't have that. The rates of disability in rural communities and tribal communities are amongst the highest in the country. As Wendy was mentioning, drop boxes are part of a solution to this, but one of the problems with drop boxes is that there aren't accessibility standards for them yet. And I'll use myself as an example. I'm somebody who has a mobility disability. I do not drive, and I did not want to use vote by mail because I didn't trust the post office last November. And so I decided that using a drop box would be the best way for me to vote. The drop box nearest to my home was completely cut off by construction. And so I had to have someone else return my ballot for me. And if I hadn't gone to vote with someone else, I would have had to completely revise my voting plan. And I'm a motivated voter, so I would have voted, but many people would have just gone back home and not voted at all.
Thank you for that. And I have to remind everyone that one of the things that I learned growing up is that if you live long enough, you will have some form of a disability. And so it's not like this is only affecting a small portion of the population. It will affect the entire population. So I want to thank you all for those comments. Can any of you describe some of the effective strategies, techniques, or technologies you've seen used or implemented that address barriers faced by voters with disabilities throughout the voting process? And are there any states or local jurisdictions that you feel are doing an exceptional job for people with disabilities?
In California, in 2019, then the state dissatisfied all the accessible equipment from before 2015 and re-noticed the difference before 2020 brings a lot of election day because the accessible equipment was not working. Now we still get a lot of, but not about that issue, which is greatly. But I will talk about that the performance, but in California, they have efforts that every county must follow when picking out only places that increase accessibility.
Yeah, if I can add to what Fred said about the Secretary of State's checklist, I mean, this is sort of low tech. I mean, it's a checklist they put on their website, but it's a great resource for county election officials and for the people that are actually going out and surveying the voting locations. It's this easy to use guide with diagrams that really helps you understand what cross slope is, what you should be looking for at entrances. And we think that has something to do with the pretty good voting location accessibility we see statewide when we do poll monitoring.
Anyone else want to add? If not, we can move to the next question. What gaps or challenges remain in making voting accessible to people with disabilities, and what kind of resources are needed to fill those gaps?
That's a big question. I'll just take a small piece of that, of one thing that I think we've probably all seen, and that is that poll worker training, at least in Texas, and maybe I'll say everywhere, but maybe I'm speaking out of turn. Maybe everything's great everywhere else, and in Texas is where it's a problem. But poll worker training is not sufficient. And I know we've all seen this. In particular, sometimes it's one poll worker knows how to work the machine. That poll worker is out sick. Okay, well then nobody knows how to work the machine that day. And I think it's certainly our position that every poll worker needs to be trained on the machines and how they work, not just where they are, but how they work, what the functions are, what they do, what the features are, troubleshooting. And then in addition, how to interact with people with disabilities. It's remarkable the types of things that we see from poll workers. And there's no reason why they can't have training on this. Certainly in Texas, and I don't know if this is elsewhere, but in Texas, especially people with intellectual disabilities are seen as people that are suspicious. Are they even eligible to vote? Who's helping them? Is that person speaking out of turn and assisting them? Texas has restrictions on the type of assistance that a person with a disability can receive. And so a lot of times people who are getting assistance at the polling location are kind of deemed suspicious, and it's more difficult for them to vote for that reason. So this is all stuff that's poll worker training. And if we had more robust, clearer, and more comprehensive poll worker training, I think we could mitigate some of that.
This is Wendy from Wisconsin, and I would echo that we see very same things. And poll worker training and partnering. We're trying very hard to partner with elections officials so that we can influence the poll worker training and help them. Because by and large, our experience has been people want to do right. They want to do a good job. They just have no idea or very little understanding. So something else that we see in Wisconsin, we have a requirement that you show an ID to vote. And that we see that there's just a lack of transportation for people to do that extra trip to the DMV. The only way to get a photo ID for voting is to go to the Department of Motor Vehicles location. With COVID, we were seeing limited DMV hours, especially in rural areas where they might only be open 1 or 2 days a week for a really limited amount of time. And a lot of our people are non-drivers. They needed to arrange a ride during the small time slot. Then when they're at the DMV, the time frame that it might take them is kind of, it could be 20 minutes, it could be an hour, it could be 2 hours. So now they have a ride waiting for them, or the ride has to come back. Very complicated for people. It's a lot of sitting and standing at the DMV, a lot of waiting. It's just the process to get that photo ID is a challenge. I just talked last week with a person who has cerebral palsy and said, I went to the DMV and I can't straighten my head. My motorized chair doesn't fit in the space to get my picture taken. And then they were telling me I had to straighten my head. My head doesn't straighten. They said they can't take the picture if my head doesn't straighten. It's not possible. It wouldn't be a legal picture. And they wanted me to have the person assisting me straighten my head, but my head doesn't go that way. And just a really hard experience with photo ID and getting that ID so that you can vote. A big challenge for people. So I think not only poll worker training would help, but also partnering with DMVs to make that process easier and more accessible.
This is Maria from APD. I think we need more resources and better process dedicated to making sure that people in congregate settings can vote. This was a huge issue during COVID, where we saw lots of restrictions on who could enter congregate settings in order to keep people safe. But that meant that voter registrars couldn't go in. That meant that anyone engaged in elections work couldn't go in to make sure that residents were informed. And often in congregate settings, people's access to information is very restricted. They may be denied access to a computer or a smartphone or other print media. And so in addition to changing our culture around institutions and making sure that community integration is real for everyone, we need to make sure that local boards of elections, county officials understand that this is a population that should be engaged whenever there is an election.
And, in our very what that I'm not trained accurately as to how acceptable it would be works. And but, and it will result in nobody knows how to set up. And then even the new and L have to use it. And what many is they don't elbows that is available. There was somebody go into his own place. They don't know it's the option. If they tell everybody about it, more people use it. And then the workers take it more seriously.
Folks have answered my next question already, but I wanted to just add that at the end of this video, we're going to try to put a link up with our disability rights card, which addresses some of these issues, and for people to be able to download or get a copy of that so that they know what their rights are when they go into a voting place for a federal election. The last question I have, to conclude this discussion, what are some of the recommendations you would have, additional recommendations you would have for election officials and for the EAC as a federal partner to improve access for voting for people with disabilities? And are there other additional resources which is in your #1 recommendation to improve the access to the ballot box for people with disabilities so they can continually, or so that they can vote independently and privately?
Our #1 wish is to have the ESC or somebody give it okay, but the electronic ballot only for people with disabilities, like people who are blind and visually impaired, people who cannot themselves because 4 years ago we got a bill passed to allow accessible ballot delivery, but rejected points that not private or accessible because somebody received my ballot when they help me envelope. We had number all about that. And gave me a lot of people that didn't maybe a couple thousand at most in California. And we're favorite state. And now that all do everyone.
We also wanted to, ask for, other states to update their voting equipment. We've just seen some real benefits in California that now all counties have new equipment. A big thing that we haven't mentioned is that poll workers themselves like the new equipment. It's just easier to use. It's less buggy, and they're more confident about it. And that confidence is contagious for voters. And Los Angeles County has a new voting system that all voters use. So every unit is accessible when you walk into a location. So it's good. We're getting really good feedback. We liked that they incorporated accessibility from the beginning in the design process, and the end product is pretty darn good. So that's the other thing we think is important, is to have not just accessible equipment, but new accessible equipment that's easy to use.
Anyone else want to add?
Sure, I'll add just a few things. That's a big question again. But I think things, smaller technologies, even like having an alarm button for curbside voting, which Texas does have curbside voting, but there are, of course, issues with people pulling up curbside, and there's no way to get in touch with the folks inside. So even small changes like that, so an alarm button for curbside voting can have just as big of an impact potentially as things like accessible mail-in ballots for people with print disabilities or visual impairments. So I think the ideas of keeping both big and small things in mind can equally have a big impact. And then, of course, just general things of making voting easier. So allowing people to universally vote by mail, or allowing for same-day voter registration in Texas, expanding early voting hours. In Texas right now, there's hopes of limiting early voting hours. And there was also something really innovative done in the last election, last couple of elections actually in Texas, called drive-through voting, which is very different than curbside voting, but allows for people to drive through and vote in their car. And that was, of course, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and was done in Harris County. Of course, now the legislature in Texas is making attempts to do away with the possibility of doing drive-through voting in the future. But things like that, having these kind of innovative ideas, have an impact for everybody, but in particular, people with disabilities who are already marginalized in the voting sphere. And any sort of opening things up for everybody is going to usually open things up for people with disabilities as well.
This is Maria from AAPD. I'll add, we've talked about this a little bit, but making sure that your Secretary of State and your county election websites are accessible and that information is provided in a straightforward way. At AAPD, we put together these state-by-state voting guides, and particularly deadlines around ballot curing deadlines were incredibly difficult for us to find. And we're, folks that have a pretty high degree of digital fluency. A lot of information that is very important to voters with disabilities, such as rules around whether or not you can vote if you're under a guardianship, is often buried on these websites. And so not only do we need the websites to be accessible, but they also need to be in a variety of formats, in a variety of languages. Information should be available in American Sign Language as well. And so to Leah's point, that may sound like a simple recommendation, but it's actually a fairly large undertaking to do. Another recommendation that we have is that there needs to be a wide menu of options for people to vote, and every option must be accessible. Because even people with the same disabilities can experience those disabilities in very different ways and need different options to vote. So with something that would make voting a lot easier, like automatic vote by mail, and even if we did have fully accessible ballots, there will still be people who will want to go to a fully accessible polling place in person and cast their ballot on an accessible machine. So we don't want to see any option precluded. We want to see as many options as possible, and all of those options be accessible.
I would echo that. This is Wendy Heyn from Disability Rights Wisconsin, and we have a large portion of our state, the northwestern part, that during COVID-19 we always knew that there were some that there was kind of an internet divide in our state and an access divide, but boy, since the COVID-19 pandemic, it's become very, very apparent that in that rural part of our state, there are a lot of people who just don't have internet access. And so those diverse ways to access accessible ballots, accessible registration are so necessary because not every voter is going to be able to access those accessible options in the same ways. We also have seen, we run a voter hotline at Disability Rights Wisconsin that voters can call anytime, and I actually answer it. And we hear a huge amount from voters in the big cities where there's lots of accessible internet access available to folks. However, a lot of them are older adults, and they just don't use computers. If I talk to them about links or websites, they'll say, "Oh, can I call you back when my granddaughter is here? She can do it for me on her phone." And so we have one part of our state where they can't access the internet. We have another part where, yeah, they could access the internet easily, but maybe they're not people who do that. So I just echo what Maria said, that it's just really, we need all those options, and we need them all to be accessible.
I think that's a wonderful way to end this, to know that, unless, did anyone have any closing comments that they wanted to make? If not, we can end on this really high note of thinking that when we look towards improving the process, that we look towards making everything accessible and expanding the process overall. I want to thank you all for being a part of this and commemorating the anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. If there's anything else, I implore you to look at our website for those folks who are reading or viewing this. And if there's any comments or questions, to direct them to our agency. Again, I want to thank you all, and have a great day.